So we're rolling.
All right.
Hey, Andy. So this is Andy Mahler, founder of Protect Our Woods, seasoned environmental activist working to protect the forests in Indiana and all across the eastern United States. So Andy, right now a lot of your work is focused on the Buffalo Springs project that the U.S. Forest Service is proposing in Orange County, Indiana.
That's correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about the background of that project and why you're fighting it?
Well, there's so much background. So my problem often is too much information. So trying to hone it down to what would be most useful. I've been involved with forest protection efforts here in southern Indiana, specifically Orange County and the Hoosier National Forest since about 1985. We encountered lots of clear cuts at that time. We discovered the Forest Service had a proposal to build off-road vehicle trails in Orange County. We organized a group called Protect Our Woods. This was in November of 1985. I'm going to jump through some major steps here, but we were successful in getting the Hoosier declared the first and only at the time National Forest closed to off-road vehicle trails. We then discovered that the clear cuts were based on something called a National Forest Management Plan. Every national forest in the country is required by the National Forest Management Act of 1976 to have a new forest plan, and those forest plans are supposed to be renewed no less or no more than every 15 years. So that forest plan in 1985 called for basically the entire Hoosier National Forest to be clear cut on either an 80 or 120 year rotation, the entire forest to be open to oil and gas drilling, and for 5 miles of road to be built for every square mile of national forest. We opposed that plan. Once again, we were successful, and when I say we, that was not just Protect Our Woods. We worked with Sierra Club, Hoosier Environmental Council, and various other groups. And we got that plan withdrawn, or at least significantly amended in 1991. After that, we helped start a group called Heartwood, which was a regional forest protection network, which was focused on trying to protect the public forests, specifically the national forests, anywhere the hardwood forest grows. And that's basically from western Massachusetts to Missouri, and from northern Mississippi to southern Minnesota. So that's a fairly broad geographic area. Within that area, we were successful in organizing public opposition to Forest Service logging plans and other things, strip mining, aerial spraying of herbicide, various other projects the Forest Service was doing. But we were remarkably successful, and within 10 years of Heartwood being founded in 1991, we had stopped all logging on the Wayne National Forest, the Shawnee National Forest in Illinois, the Waynes in Ohio, the Hoosier, the Allegheny in Pennsylvania, the Daniel Boone in Kentucky, the Mark Twain in Missouri, and a few other forests too, mostly through litigation, but we tried everything we could think of. We were a very small group, very, very modest budget, and we were remarkably successful. And so I mention all this just as background because after we experienced a great deal of success in raising public awareness about what the Forest Service was proposing for the national forests of the hardwood region, and then successfully defending them through litigation, a lot of us went on to do other things. Now, Heartwood, of course, still existed. At that time, we started the Indiana Forest Alliance to focus on the damage and the destruction that was going on in the state forests. So Indiana Forest Alliance was founded as a statewide forest protection network, collecting the efforts of the various groups working to protect forests to focus on the destruction that was happening in the state forests. So I got involved with various other issues after I stopped being a full-time forest protection activist. Did a lot of community organizing, especially around food and music. Started farmers markets, helped start a member-owned natural foods co-op. All right, that's all background. Now, October of 2021. In January of that year, we'd gotten a little colorful little newsletter from the Forest Service talking about some Buffalo Springs newsletter. I didn't know what Buffalo Springs was. There is no such place as Buffalo Springs. I didn't give it much thought. They talked about this area in southern Orange County where we live, where we are sitting right now, as being a lovely place, lots of cultural, historical, and archaeological significance, the karst topography, the caves, the springs, the rock shelters, the recreation opportunities, the 4 designated recreation trails, the Buffalo Trace, the African settlement, the free slave settlement in in the eastern part of the county that was then known as Little Africa. Talked about the biodiversity, talked about the water quality. So, like I say, we didn't give it much thought. Then in October of 2021, get a little mailer from the Forest Service, and it's a scoping notice for a project called Buffalo Springs, which triggered my memory. Oh yes, now I remember, we got that newsletter back in January. But the scoping notice didn't mention the recreation, didn't mention the karst, didn't mention the wildlife and the biodiversity. It was all about cutting timber. Now, obviously, they had lots of rationalizations for why they were going to cut the timber, but it was a 30,000 acre project area within which 18,000 acres is in national forest management, public ownership, and 12,000 acres in private ownership, including our land. It called for over 5,000 acres of logging, of which more than 1,300 acres were going to be clear cut. It called for converting 8 miles of the 13-mile horse trail that runs past our house here into logging roads to service those various clear cuts and other forms of logging operations. It called for spraying herbicide on close to 800 acres of the area, and it called for burning 15,000 acres, including our land. It called for burning 15,000 acres repeatedly, burning 2, 3, and more times. It called for this all to be done over a 10 or more year period of time, so that the horse trail past our house here would have been converted to would be, if they were to be successful in getting this project approved, converted into a logging road. The peace and quiet we enjoy here at our home, which we call the Lazy Black Bear, at the end of a dead-end road surrounded by the Hoosier National Forest, would have been completely disrupted, and our lives would have been completely changed, well, as they have been just by them proposing it, let alone by them implementing it. So with this Buffalo Springs proposal, and I should mention that there is no such place as Buffalo Springs. It's a mashup of the names Buffalo Trace, which is the old travel way used by migrating herds of bison and other wildlife by native and indigenous peoples of the area, and by the early pioneers. It was the major travel way between the Ohio River and the Wabash River, and with Paola being just about exactly halfway between the Wabash and the Ohio. And then the Springs Valley, the two major resort towns of French Lick and West Baden are collectively known as Springs Valley. So that was the mashup of the names that brought forth Buffalo Springs. Now, Buffalo Springs is a very powerful and evocative name because the spring is something that speaks very much to the heart of the human experience of being dependent on water on a watery planet. So a spring is water that comes pure and clean right out of the ground. Here in Orange County, it comes right out of the limestone rocks, which filter them and give it a very sweet flavor. You may know that you don't make bourbon with distilled water. You make bourbon with branch water. And branch water is water that comes from limestone, because the limestone gives the whiskey certain characteristic qualities that distinguish it from other forms of alcohol. So bourbon is not an Indiana product. Of course, it's a Kentucky product, but it's a product of limestone karst springs. That is the best water for humans, and it's the best water for making the best alcohol, according to those who make alcohol. That doesn't happen to be one of my skills, but I just mention that because there's something about the spring that speaks very much to it's an iconic representation of the life force, is water just flowing, water, the source of life, water flowing directly from the ground. And of course, the bison or buffalo is the iconic North American mammal, and it's one that speaks to my heart, and I'm sure it speaks to many other Americans too, because it is the quintessential mammalian species of the North American continent. So Buffalo Springs, it's a very evocative name. We were a little upset at first that they were threatening this area that didn't exist, and yet it does exist because it's our home and the homes of so many of the other people I know here in this area. But they also gave us the gift in that the initials of Buffalo Springs are BS. And BS is exactly what this proposal is. It is BS. The Forest Service claims to be doing all this logging for all sorts of high-minded and beneficial purposes, but the ultimate reason the Forest Service is proposing to do all this logging, if you scrape away all the BS, you discover that the Forest Service gets to keep virtually all of the money that they receive when they sell the timber from when they're cutting the trees that the American people are paying them to protect. They keep the money from selling those trees for their own administrative purposes. Now, the Forest Service back in the middle of the last century and up for several decades thereafter was considered the most widely respected and most highly regarded federal agency. Those days, of course, are long gone. But at the time when the Forest Service was considered the most respected federal agency, they did mostly three things on the public lands in the eastern United States and in the West too, but I'm more familiar with the eastern U.S. The three things they did were protect water quality by planting trees on heavily eroded abandoned farms, which is what most of the land that's in the National Forest System in the eastern United States, where that land came from. It's not like the western lands where that land was in public ownership before it was designated as a semi-protected status. In the eastern United States, all of the national forests were established through the provisions of, almost all of them through the provisions of the Weeks Act of 1911, I believe it was, that allowed the federal government, in cooperation with the states, to establish purchase areas within which the federal government was authorized to acquire land. Most of that land was heavily degraded and highly abused land that had been farmed in such a way that it was no longer productive. It happened to coincide with the Depression in the 20s and so forth, that a lot of that land was acquired, often at tax sale, often for 50 cents, $1, $1.50, $2, $3, $5 an acre. So the Hoosier National Forest was designated in the 30s. It was formally established as a national forest in 1951 on these heavily abused and degraded lands, and the land has been healing itself with the help of the Forest Service since that time. Like I say, the main things they did, they tried to protect water quality by doing pine plantations on the most heavily eroded and highly erodible sites. They prevented timber theft, and they put out forest fires. And fires were fairly rampant at that time because the land had been so heavily abused. A lot of it was anthropogenic fire caused by humans, and it continued to plague the landscape as those recovering lands struggled to restore themselves to forested condition. I mentioned those three things that the Forest Service did when they were the most respected agency because it's interesting to compare what they did then. Instead of planting pines to protect highly erodible sites, they're now proposing to clear cut the pines on those same highly erodible sites and therefore redegrade the land and re-endanger the water supplies. And it should be mentioned that on those pine plantations, the hardwoods are naturally regenerating under the pines, and yet if they clear cut the pines, those naturally regenerating hardwoods will be destroyed, and the reset button will go back to zero, and we'll start all over again with a bare and denuded landscape, baked by the sun, pounded by the rain, and blown by the wind, so that the soils will all be on the move again, and all that carbon that's been stored in the soil will be released into the atmosphere. So they want to clear cut the pines on the highly erodible sites. Instead of putting out fires, they now want to burn 15,000 acres, including our land, only with our permission, mind you, but still it's quite a surprise to see our land included on the map as the areas slated for burning. So instead of putting out fires, they now want to burn the land repeatedly. They want to convert what is a fire-resistant forest. It's a very, very wet forest. You know, some of the lands out west that are susceptible to these catastrophic fires that we've seen in the news over the past few years, they might only get 4, 8, or 15 inches of rain a year. Well, there have been some rainstorms here in southern Indiana where we get 4 inches of rain in one rainstorm. But the Forest Service instead is proposing to convert our extremely wet forest, and here in southern Indiana we get approximately 48 inches of rainfall a year, converting our highly fire-resistant forest into a fire-adapted forest to favor those species. That was my dog Digby bouncing the tripod there. to favor those species that responded well to the heavily abused and degraded landscape that the Forest Service found when the National Forest was first established. So they call it the Buffalo Springs Restoration Project. The two things that they want to restore is, one is the abused and degraded landscape that they found when they first established the National Forest. But the other thing they want to restore is their budget, because the third thing they're doing is, instead of preventing timber theft, they are cutting down the publicly owned forests and keeping the money. Some might call that timber theft, but obviously they call it management, or in this case, restoration. So what they're proposing to restore with the Buffalo Springs Restoration Project is the abused and degraded landscape that they found back in the 20s and 30s, from which the National Forest was established, and they want to restore their budget.
Wow. Thank you, Andy. Do you have anything else that you might want to add?
Well, yes, because I mean, I have spent a good chunk of my adult life opposing bad things, and many of those proposed by the Forest Service. There have been other things, hazardous waste incinerators, strip mines, you name it. But the Forest Service is paid by the American people to manage the national forest in the interests of the American people. Sadly, the Forest Service now equates the interests of their own administrative agency with the interests of the land and the people. Their motto is caring for the land and serving the people. But in fact, what they are doing is caring for their own administrative priorities. If you read the first sentence of the Buffalo Springs proposal says that the forest is proposing to do all this activity. Well, no. It's not the forest that is proposing to do all this activity. The forest is proposing to grow and prosper and multiply and provide habitat for as many different species as possible. It's not the forest that's proposing all this logging, burning, and herbicide spraying. It's the Forest Service. And why are they proposing it? Not to serve the people, but to serve their own administrative purpose. Now, I don't want to be in an oppositional or confrontational relationship with the Forest Service. I have a great deal of respect for a lot of the people and the expertise of the people that work for that agency. But what I would like to see is us working cooperatively to truly provide for the needs of the American people and to protect those values that the American people most dearly value in the National Forest, which is recreational opportunities, water quality, carbon sequestration, climate moderation, protection of recreational sites and archaeological and historic sites, and so on. So what we want to do is we want to work for a positive vision for the Hoosier National Forest rather than work against this backward-looking plan that the Forest Service is using, because the plan, I don't think I mentioned this, the Buffalo Springs proposal is based on a plan that was written in 2006, over 16 years ago. And when you start with when that plan was initially proposed back in around 2000, this is a 20-year-old plan. They are managing the National Forest based on the priorities of the agency from 20 years ago. And when you think about the fact that the Biden administration has proposed something called 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the landscape of North America, of the United States by 2030, 2030 is only 8 years away, whereas 2006, when they wrote this plan, that's 16 years ago. So we've got to start looking ahead, and the Forest Service it's like they're driving, looking in the rearview mirror and sort of ignoring the fact that there is a big freight train called climate change coming right at us at a high rate of speed. So we would like to see the Forest Service shift their priorities, change their focus, and start looking to the future rather than the past, and start working with the American people rather than in opposition to the wishes of the American people to manage the public lands for the future that our children are going to be inhabiting, with a dramatically changed set of circumstances, including, there's a lot of changes happening in the forest already because of climate change. And the last thing we need to do is be making this a dry fire adapted forest, when the best thing we have going for us is the rain, the soil, and the water that the forest protects.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking.
Absolutely.